She walked into kitchens, carrying no weapon, no poison, just a smile and a skillet. Yet, wherever she went, people began to die. Tonight, we step into the shadow of New York's most infamous cook, the woman history remembers as Typhoid Mary.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
In the summer of 1906, a mysterious killer struck the quiet luxury of Oyster Bay, Long Island. 6 people fell ill in a home that should have been safe from disease, and the culprit was nowhere to be found. But whispers began to point to one woman, a healthy-seeming Irish cook named Mary Mallon. For years, she moved from household to household, leaving sickness and death in her wake, defying doctors and vanishing before suspicion could catch her. Was she a malicious spreader or an unwitting carrier of an invisible killer? We'll dive deep right after this. In the swelter of summer 1906, a peculiar terror gripped the genteel enclave of Oyster Bay, Long Island. A wealthy banker's family, enjoying a seaside retreat, was struck by typhoid fever. 6 of the 11 people in the household fell desperately ill within a single week. Typhoid was a dreaded killer marked by spiking fevers, weakness, stomach pain, and rose-colored rashes. Its victims could become delirious or deathly ill with intestinal hemorrhage. Such outbreaks were usually confined to overcrowded slums or places with tainted water and poor sanitation. Yet there was typhoid invading a pristine summer mansion near the President of the United States' own vacation home. An occurrence so unusual in Oyster Bay that it simply baffled doctors. Fearing the house would become tainted property, the panicked landlord hired experts to hunt for the source. They tested every pipe, every well, and every cesspool on the estate. All came back negative for contamination. The typhoid bacillus seemed to strike from nowhere, an invisible curse in an otherwise idyllic setting. That Oyster Bay outbreak was not an isolated anomaly. In the ensuing months, similar clusters of typhoid popped up in well-to-do households around New York City. A sense of dread grew as affluent families, people who prided themselves on clean living, succumbed to this filth-associated disease. Health inspectors were perplexed. How could typhoid infiltrate homes that had modern plumbing, filtered water, and careful, almost meticulous housekeeping? Whispers of uncanny coincidence spread. Different families, different neighborhoods, yet one mysterious commonality. Each household had recently hired an Irish cook. When the sickness struck, this cook often vanished soon after, leaving no forwarding address. The families involved only recalled that she was a robust, healthy-seeming woman. In an era when most doctors still believed a person had to be visibly ill to spread infection, the idea of a healthy human carrier was nearly unthinkable. Thus, these outbreaks were cloaked in mystery and fear. Was this cook a malicious poisoner, or could she herself be an unwitting, invisible contagion? It was a question that defied the medical understanding of the time, lending the situation an eerie and almost supernatural aura. Determined to solve the puzzle, New York authorities turned to sanitary engineer George A. Soper, a relentless investigator of disease outbreaks. Soper had already been probing typhoid cases among the rich, a bizarre pattern since typhoid flourished in squalor, not in mansions. Soper's investigation played out like a detective novel. Interview by interview, he followed the faint trail of that itinerant cook. He soon discovered that over the previous few years, a single Irish cook, a woman in her 30s named Mary Mallon, had worked for 8 different families, and 7 of those households had suffered typhoid fever outbreaks. This was beyond coincidence. Soper had identified a human vector connecting scattered tragedies, as if death itself traveled by apron and ladle. In early 1907, Soper finally tracked Mary Mallon to a Park Avenue penthouse where another typhoid case was brewing. He confronted her in the kitchen while she was at work. It was a tense, surreal standoff. A healthy cook accused of harboring a deadly disease. Soper did his best to explain that she might be the carrier responsible for the sickness, asking politely for samples of her blood, urine, and stool. Mary Mallon, strong-willed and understandably shocked, flew into a rage. She brandished a carving fork at Soper, shouting that he had no right to insult her with such accusations. To Mary, the claim was absurd. How could she be spreading typhoid if she herself had never been sick? She indignantly denied Soper's request, chasing the investigator out of the kitchen with utensil in hand. Soper later wrote that Mary's demeanor was of someone, quote, who could not see reason because she firmly believed she was being unjustly persecuted. Undeterred, Soper dug deeper into Mary's past, compiling a dossier of her employment history. He mapped out the outbreaks in time and place, finding Mary at the epicenter of cluster after cluster. By now, Soper was convinced that Mary Mallon was a healthy carrier, a person teeming with Salmonella typhi bacteria, but immune to its effects, a medical phenomenon barely documented at that time. In a last attempt to obtain proof, Soper tracked Mary to the home of her boyfriend. He brought along a doctor to help plead his case that providing specimens could save lives. But Mary, deeply suspicious, again refused to cooperate, vehemently insisting that typhoid is everywhere and blaming the outbreaks on bad luck or bad water. She simply could not accept that she was the source. After all, she felt perfectly fine. In truth, Mary's reaction was not unusual. Even many physicians were unaware that a person could spread deadly germs while remaining healthy to all who observed. This critical misunderstanding set the stage for a public health showdown. Realizing that persuasion had failed, Soper appealed to the New York City Health Department. The idea of an invisible carrier was met with initial skepticism, but the pattern of evidence was compelling. Mary Mallon was identified as a public menace in waiting. If Soper was correct, every meal she cooked was a loaded weapon. On March 19, 1907, the authorities decided to act decisively. Armed with sections 1169 and 1170 of the City Health Code, which gave them power to isolate disease threats, officials moved to arrest Mary Mallon as a public health danger. Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker, a pioneering woman physician in the Department of Health, led the effort to bring Mary in. Baker recounted that Mary did not come quietly. Upon arrival at Mary's workplace, or, according to some accounts, the boarding house where she was staying, Mary bolted, determined to evade capture. What followed sounds like a scene from a kind of gothic thriller. Mary reportedly fled through rooms and even tried hiding in a closet or small room. One popular telling says she was even found in a neighbor's shed, but accounts vary. Officers scoured the premises. It ultimately took 5 policemen to corner and subdue the panicked woman. Dr. Baker herself had to physically sit on top of Mary during the ambulance ride in order to prevent her escape. To Mary, it must have felt like a nightmarish assault. She was being torn away against her will, having committed no crime except for cooking for people who happened to fall ill. Her fear and anger were palpable, but the law was on the side of the doctors. The city, gripped by dread of contagion, would err on the side of caution. Mary Mallon was whisked away to an isolation ward at Willard Parker Hospital, a facility for infectious diseases. There, behind locked doors, she was subjected to medical examinations that she found deeply humiliating. She was restrained and forced to surrender samples of her blood, urine, and stool for analysis. For the first 4 days, Mary was not even allowed to get up to use the bathroom on her own, a stark loss of dignity that she later bitterly described in letters. The laboratory results confirmed Soper's theory. Mary's stool was teeming with typhoid bacteria in numbers beyond anything the doctors had seen, essentially proving that she carried the infection internally. Investigators believed her gallbladder harbored the deadly bacteria, shedding pathogens that hitchhiked on her hands to whatever food she touched. Mary admitted a telling detail. She rarely bothered to wash her hands while cooking. In fairness, strict hygiene was not routine in that era. Germ theory was still relatively new and not universally accepted by the general public. But Mary's steadfast refusal to accept the findings made her a singular challenge. Faced with a healthy but infectious individual who rebuffed all cooperation, the city's solution was extreme and unprecedented. In a highly unusual move, New York authorities banished Mary Mallon to a quarantine facility on North Brother Island, a small windswept island in the East River, isolated from mainland New York. On October 19, 1907, Mary began her involuntary exile at the island's Riverside Hospital, effectively becoming a prisoner with a pathogen for a crime. She was given a cottage to live in on hospital grounds, but under constant observation. 3 times a week, nurses collected her bodily samples, an ongoing scientific curiosity and a precaution to gauge her level of contagion. Health officials went so far as to suggest an experimental surgery to remove her gallbladder, hoping to cure her carrier state. Mary vehemently refused the operation, partially because she still did not believe she carried the disease, and partially because gallbladder surgery at the time was risky and often fatal. In one frustrated outburst, she reportedly said they'd never find typhoid in her gallbladder because she, quote, never had typhoid in her life. To Mary, the quarantine felt like a gross injustice. She was being punished, though she had done nothing intentionally wrong. What's more, she faced a grim personal dilemma. Cooking was her livelihood and passion, yet it was now forever forbidden to her. As a cook for affluent families, she earned about $50 a month. As a laundress, the job the city suggested as an alternative, she'd earn barely $20. In 1907, $50, adjusted for inflation, was worth roughly $1,724.14. With no husband, no family, and no fortune, Mary Mallon saw the quarantine as a life sentence of poverty and loneliness. In the early days of her confinement, Mary's plight attracted considerable press attention. The newspapers dubbed her Typhoid Mary, a nickname that would stick in the public's imagination. In sensationalistic articles, she was painted as the arch-villainess of germs, a sort of angel of death in a kitchen apron. Some papers claimed Mary had lunged at doctors with knives and forks, fighting and swearing like a madwoman during her capture. This image of a violent, contagion-spreading woman both fascinated and terrified the public. Mary Mallon, a flesh-and-blood person, was quickly turning into a legend of modern folklore. Typhoid Mary, the healthy cook who left a trail of sickness. Privately, Mary was humiliated by the moniker. Typhoid Mary became a household term, and not in a flattering way. It implied evil, willful contamination. Stung by this, Mary once wrote to her lawyer, quote, "I wonder how the said Dr. William H. Park would like to be insulted and put in the journal and call him or his wife Typhoid William Park." Her resentment is evident. She felt she was being slandered and made into a public freak. Indeed, Mary saw herself as a victim of a flawed system. During her confinement, she complained of being treated like a guinea pig for doctors' experiments. She endured aggressive medical treatments. At one point, they put her on months of experimental urotropin therapy, an antiseptic drug that made her feel horribly ill. Paradoxically, even as they bled and purged her for science, officials neglected basic humane care. For 6 months, Mary wasn't allowed a specialist to treat a paralyzed eyelid that she had to tape shut each night. It's easy to imagine the psychological toll this all would take. At one stage, Mary suffered a nervous breakdown from the stress and isolation. Mary Mallon grew increasingly embittered. Importantly, not everyone in the medical community agreed with Mary's draconian quarantine. Prominent public health experts like Milton J. Rosenau and Charles V. Chapin argued that Mary did not need to be isolated for life, and that with proper education, she could live freely without endangering others. They considered the indefinite confinement overly harsh, essentially punishment without a trial for a woman who had never intended any harm. Mary herself never stopped insisting on her innocence. In fact, with the help of a friend, she managed to send her samples to a private lab in 1908, and several came back negative for typhoid. Even the health department's own tests occasionally found no trace of the bacteria. About 1 in 4 of her samples tested on the island were reportedly clean. These intermittent negatives bolstered Mary's disbelief. At times, it seemed she didn't have the germ at all. Was she being persecuted for nothing? Mary was furious and desperate to clear her name. In 1909, she filed a legal complaint against the New York Health Department, seeking her freedom by court order. But the New York Supreme Court dismissed her case, upholding the authorities' power to detain her in the name of public safety. The judge was unconvinced that releasing Mary would be safe. Defeated in court and confined back to her lonely island bungalow, Mary Mallon could only wait and hope that public opinion might turn in her favor. In February 1910, after nearly 3 years in captivity, Mary finally got the break she had been praying for. A new health commissioner, Eugene H. Porter, took a more sympathetic view. Studies had estimated that there were hundreds of other healthy typhoid carriers silently residing in New York. Quote, "We cannot keep in detention all these people. Then why single out and imprison one?" An editorial in Science questioned pointedly. Porter agreed that continued isolation of Mary alone made little sense if many others roamed free. So, on February 19, 1910, Mary Mallon was released from North Brother Island under one crucial condition. She had to promise never to work as a cook again, and to take precautions to avoid transmitting disease. Mary swore an affidavit to that effect. Acutely aware that the public was watching, the health department framed the deal as mercy mixed with responsibility. Typhoid Mary was given a second chance at freedom, contingent on her compliance. Mary walked off the island and back into society, seemingly chastened. But the eerie tale of Typhoid Mary was far from over. For 5 years, Mary Mallon blended seamlessly into the bustling fabric of New York City. At first, health officials helped her find honest work that posed no risk. She toiled in a laundromat, scrubbing clothes for minimal wages. It was grueling, menial labor, a far cry from the relative prestige and better pay she had enjoyed as a household cook. Mary grew bitter in her view. She had done nothing wrong, yet was barred from the one thing she was good at. Despite her promise, eventually Mary Mallon reverted to cooking, unable to resist the pull of her old livelihood. Sometime around 1911 or 1912, she dropped from sight. Mary adopted false surnames like Mary Brown or Breshoff in order to mask her identity. Under these aliases, she drifted through a succession of kitchens, restaurants, hotels, boarding houses, places where no one would recognize the infamous name, Mallon. For a while, she stayed one step ahead of the authorities. Outbreaks of typhoid continued to flurry here and there, striking staff and patrons in establishments where she worked. But Mary was cunning enough to move on before suspicion caught up. George Soper, upon hearing rumors of new typhoid clusters, sometimes suspected Mary's return, but he could not pin down her whereabouts. It was as if a ghost had resurfaced, the specter of Typhoid Mary, leaving illness in her wake and then disappearing into the urban throng. In 1915, Mary Mallon's luck ran out. That winter, a severe typhoid outbreak erupted in the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. 25 people, mostly new mothers and hospital staff, fell ill, and 2 of them died. The cluster was aggressively investigated by health officials. When the hospital's head obstetrician learned that their recently hired cook, an older Irish woman, had suddenly vanished as the sickness spread, alarms rang. He contacted George Soper, who immediately suspected the horrible truth. Soper rushed to Sloan Hospital and gathered descriptions from the staff. The fugitive cook's physical appearance, accent, habits, they all matched Mary Mallon. In a final confirmation, Soper examined the cook's handwriting on hospital employment records, recognizing it as Mary's script. There was no doubt. Typhoid Mary had struck again, this time in one of the worst places imaginable. A hospital full of vulnerable newborns and mothers. News of Mary's betrayal spread faster than the pathogen itself. Public opinion, which had been somewhat sympathetic to her plight upon her 1910 release, now swung sharply against her. The newspapers had a field day with the story. Mary Mallon was vilified as an incorrigible human culture tube, and, as one paper snarled, a walking typhoid fever factory. Editorials scolded her for deliberately throwing away the chance she'd been given to live freely. The moniker Typhoid Mary, once used with a mix of fear and pity, now became a label of outright condemnation. She was depicted as a knowing perpetrator, a woman who weaponized her cooking, trading innocent lives for her own livelihood. Many who had earlier questioned the fairness of her treatment fell silent, convinced that Mary was either recklessly indifferent or willfully malicious. Once again, Mary Mallon went on the run, a fugitive in the city where she had lived for decades. The net was closing, After a few weeks, authorities tracked her down in a house out on Long Island. In a bitter twist of irony, Mary was apprehended while cooking a meal for a friend. She had been bringing food to someone in need, unwittingly giving herself away. On March 27, 1915, police arrested Mary Mallon for the second and final time. There would be no release or reprieve this time. The healthy carrier had violated the public trust, and fear of her was now greater than ever. Even Mary seemed to know that her freedom had run its course. There are hints that she went quietly, perhaps exhausted by years of defiance. As the patrol boat carried her back across the East River to North Brother Island, Mary Mallon's fate was sealed. She would live out the rest of her days in quarantine, a lifetime exile for the crime of harboring an invisible killer. Upon her return to North Brother Island in 1915, Mary Mallon became a permanent resident of the quarantine hospital. She was now in her mid-40s, facing the prospect of spending the remainder of her life utterly isolated. Neither prisoner nor truly free, a unique sort of internee. To occupy her time and give her a sense of purpose, the hospital staff eventually gave Mary a small job in the laboratory. She washed bottles, recorded data, and helped the pathologists in basic tasks. In these routine activities, Mary found a semblance of normalcy. Witnesses say she carried out her duties diligently and without complaint, perhaps grateful to have any occupation at all. But tellingly, she never admitted to or apologized for causing illness. To the end, Mary maintained that the outbreaks linked to her were not her fault. Over the years, the strictness of her confinement eased, albeit slightly. By 1918, she was allowed occasional supervised day trips to the mainland, perhaps short excursions to shop or attend mass, always under the watchful eye of a guard. But North Brother Island remained her home, a lonely speck of land dominated by a hulking hospital and a graveyard of hopes. Mary watched from afar as the skyline of New York evolved through the roaring 20s and the depression of the 30s, a city roaring with life and progress that she could only glimpse from her isolation. Few visitors came to see her. She began to fade into semi-obscurity. Still, the legend of Typhoid Mary occasionally resurfaced in tabloids and medical journals, often as a cautionary tale or sensational story. Throughout Mary's long confinement, the media's stance on her case evolved. Early coverage, especially after 1915, painted Mary as almost a caricature of contagion, the woman who served death for dinner. Headlines ran calling her the most harmless and yet the most harmful woman in America, a reference to her mild demeanor but deadly effect, and described her extraordinary predicament as a healthy prisoner of New York's quarantine hospital. Over time, however, some journalists began to question whether Mary was truly a villain. Later articles acknowledged that Mallon hadn't originally known she was spreading disease, and they shifted blame toward the bacteria itself, portraying Mary more as a tragic conduit of germs beyond her control. By the 1920s and 30s, a more nuanced sympathy crept into the narrative. Papers reported that Mary lived alone on the island, forbidden from even making phone calls except to speak with her doctors or guards. The tone became wistful. After all, here was a woman who, for decades, watched the world from a prison of public health, her only crime being a quirk of biology. Still, health officials countered these sympathetic tales with their own narrative: that Mary received excellent care and comfortable accommodations, and that she alone was to blame for her predicament by refusing to follow through with her agreement. In truth, Mary Mallon's case sat uncomfortably at the intersection of compassion and fear. Mary remained on North Brother Island for 23 years. In 1932, at the age of 62, she suffered a major stroke that left her partly paralyzed. From then on, she was confined to a hospital bed and required nursing care. Even in her frail state, the rule remained: Mary could not leave the island. She died there of pneumonia on November 11th, 1938, at the age of 69. Only 9 people attended her funeral, a quiet end for someone whose name had once been shouted in headlines. Mary's body was cremated, and amid some controversy, an autopsy was reportedly performed. According to some accounts, examiners finally found living typhoid bacteria lurking in her gallbladder after death, validating the theory that had condemned her. However, George Soper contended that no autopsy was actually done, suggesting this detail may have been fabricated in order to placate public opinion. Even in death, Typhoid Mary's story maintained a touch of mystery and suspicion. Mary Mallon's case was a watershed for American public health and a lightning rod for ethical debate. She was the first asymptomatic carrier in the U.S. ever identified and forcibly isolated, setting a precedent that raised uncomfortable questions. Could an innocent person be locked away indefinitely to protect society at large? What of that person's rights and dignity? For the New York authorities in 1907, the law was clear enough. Under the charter's infectious disease provisions, they had wide powers to detain and quarantine anyone deemed a public threat. Courts of the era overwhelmingly sided with public health over individual liberty. When Mary legally challenged their detention, the judges emphasized the duty of the state to, quote, protect the health of the community, effectively giving wide latitude to health officials. Mary Mallon's ordeal highlighted how those powers, once invoked, can become alarmingly broad. As one legal scholar later noted, the power to isolate for public health, quote, rivals the criminal justice system in severity. Yet those subjected to it historically enjoyed few of the legal protections afforded to criminal defendants. Mary had no trial by jury, no presumption of innocence. Typhoid bacteria were her unseen accusers and jailers. This uncomfortable fact did not escape notice, even at the time. Some public voices argued that Mary was being treated more harshly than a typhoid patient who was visibly ill. Those patients, after all, were treated and released once recovered. Why should a healthy woman be punished more severely than sick ones? It was a conundrum that the law struggled to answer in 1909, and one that remains a point of debate to this day. Complicating matters further were issues of class, gender, and prejudice. Mary Mallon was an immigrant woman with little social standing, an Irish domestic servant in an era when the upper crust often blamed immigrants for urban ills. Historian Judith Walser-Levitt observed that while Mary wasn't isolated because she was Irish or female, those attributes, quote, evoked certain prejudices that made it easier for officials to view her as deviant, untrustworthy, and ultimately expendable. Indeed, Mary's defiance and intemperate language when dealing with male authorities likely reinforced their bias that she was a coarse, unruly woman in need of firm control. Contrast her treatment with that of other carriers. By 1910, health experts knew that perhaps 2 to 4% of typhoid patients become chronic carriers. Many carriers were identified in New York after Mary. By 1918, hundreds had been cataloged, yet none was cast into a permanent quarantine, except Mary. One contemporary carrier, a German-born bakery owner, was caught breaking the same no-food handling rule that Mary did, and authorities did not imprison him. Only Mary earned that penalty. Another carrier, Frederick Mosh, infected more people than Mary ever did, but as a married breadwinner, he was viewed sympathetically. Mosh was briefly detained in 1915, the same year as Mary's second capture, and then released to go home on condition he reported regularly. The state even paid his rent while he was monitored at liberty. Mary Mallon received no such leniency or support. The contrast is stark and telling. Many have since asked, was Mary Mallon simply made a scapegoat? From one perspective, Mary's stubbornness and repeated transgressions made her an easy figure to demonize. It was more satisfying for the public to focus anger on Typhoid Mary, a single, personalized villain, than to confront the broader, inconvenient truth that typhoid fever was a systemic problem. New York City's sanitation infrastructure, while improving, still allowed outbreaks of waterborne and foodborne illness. By blaming Mary, society found a convenient other upon whom to pin its fears. An immigrant cook from the Lower East Side slums became, in effect, the embodiment of disease in the public mind. As one article later pondered, was it all too easy to make an immigrant working-class woman culpable for, even synonymous with, a disease? Mary's case certainly carried undertones of discrimination. A lone woman against the male-dominated medical and legal establishment of the time. And once the sensational nickname Typhoid Mary took hold, it was as if her humanity fell away, replaced by a symbol of contagion. the press and public could discuss Typhoid Mary as almost a monster or a cautionary tale, losing sight of Mary Mallon, the person. On the other hand, health officials argued vigorously that Mary left them no choice. She violated the agreement they had painstakingly reached with her, showing callous disregard for public safety. Even decades later, some commentators would harshly call Mary's return to cooking an act verging on second-degree murder. They pointed out that Mary knew by 1915 that her body carried typhoid. She had been told so repeatedly. Yet she still chose personal income over the lives of strangers. To these critics, Mary Mallon's fate was a regrettable but necessary example. A single, stubborn carrier that caused at least 122 people to fall ill and 5 to die by one estimate. So isolating her was the only way to prevent further innocent victims. Indeed, supporters of the health department noted that Mary was given chances that she squandered. If she had kept her word in 1910, they argued, she would not have been in that situation. This debate over Mary's culpability versus her victimhood has never been fully settled, and it ensures that her story is retold, not just as a medical saga, but as a moral and legal parable. Mary Mallon's true inner thoughts remained largely obscured by time. Did she ever privately acknowledge the damage she had done? Some suspect Mary may have known more than she let on. Perhaps she noticed the pattern of illness trailing her and lived in denial, rationalizing each outbreak as bad luck. Her decision to resume cooking after her first quarantine hints at a complex mix of desperation, pride, and perhaps defiance. We can imagine Mary telling herself that the doctors were wrong, that she couldn't possibly be responsible, and yet changing her name, moving frequently as if some part of her understood the danger. Was she driven by necessity alone? Or was there an element of resentment that if the city took away her livelihood, she would take her chances and damn the consequences? We will never know for sure. What we do know is that Mary Mallon's saga is not a simple fable of right and wrong, but rather a cautionary tale about ignorance, fear, and the collision between individual rights and community welfare. Mary's legacy is reflected in the very language we use today. Typhoid Mary entered the lexicon as a term for anyone who knowingly or unknowingly spreads misfortune or disease. It is rarely remembered that behind the label stood a real person. Mary Mallon's case forced the medical world to recognize the phenomenon of asymptomatic carriers, a discovery that likely saved countless lives by improving how epidemics were traced and contained. Yet, it also showed the dark side of public health enforcement. The ethical questions raised by Mary's confinement have echoed through later crises. From tuberculosis sanatoriums to HIV quarantines and beyond. How far should society go to protect itself? Mary's story has been studied in law schools and public health courses as a classic dilemma. Even in the 21st century, when the COVID-19 pandemic brought quarantine back into everyday life, commentators hearkened back to Typhoid Mary as a precedent and warning. In the end, Mary Mallon spent nearly 30 years in isolation for a disease that never made her sick in any way. She stands as a haunting figure in history, the healthy woman who became, unwittingly, an angel of death. Her life story is suffused with eerie elements, a trail of illness with no visible source, a determined detective hunting an unseen killer, an island quarantine that became a lifelong banishment. It's a tale that invites both sympathy and censure. Mary's fate prompts us to ask difficult questions about blame, responsibility, and compassion in the face of invisible threats. Over a century later, Typhoid Mary's ghost lingers in our collective consciousness, a reminder that sometimes the deadliest peril can wear a human face, smiling, cooking, and apparently healthy, while danger silently stirs within. Tonight, we retraced the uneasy footsteps of Mary Mallon, or Typhoid Mary, a woman who never felt sick, yet left sickness in her wake. A cook by trade, an outcast by headline, she became the center of a battle between individual liberty and public safety, and the face of a fear you cannot see. Was Mary a willful offender who refused to change her ways, or a working woman trapped by limited choices and a medical science still learning its own rules? Quarantine orders, false names, quiet kitchens. Her story was written in court papers and cutting boards, in laboratories and tenement hallways. The disease did not argue. It simply moved. More than a century later, the questions she raised are still with us. How do we protect each other from what is, by all intents and purposes, invisible? Who decides when one person's freedom ends and another's safety begins? And when the emergency passes, what remains? Justice, or a cautionary tale whispered through time? Listen closely. In the hush after midnight, a sink drips. In an empty kitchen, a door swings on its hinge. A hand reaches for a ladle. There is no shadow on the wall, no footprint on the door, only a presence smaller than a breath, waiting on a surface that looks clean, riding a habit that goes unbroken. It does not need a name to do its work, and it never has. For some, Typhoid Mary is a villain, for others a victim. For all of us, she is a reminder that the deadliest intruders don't knock. They're carried in quietly by the ones we trust, the ones we love, the ones who never knew. And somewhere, tonight, there is another kitchen light flicking on, another meal beginning, and perhaps another story no one will notice until it's far too late. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com. And produced by Dan Wilder. With original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.